はい、皆さん、こんにちは。グリーンゾンジャパンのミキです。オレゴン州では2023年にシロシビンを使った精神療法が合法化されました。昨年はポートランドにあるイマーシブセラピーという治療センターを取材して動画をお届けしましたが、今年も引き続きオレゴンの取材を続けています。今日ご紹介するのは、オレゴン州アシュランドにあるヒドゥンスプリングス、隠れた泉という名前のウェルネスセンターにお勤めの自然療法医、ドクター・イアン・ルエプカーです。ヒドゥンスプリングスでは様々な疾患に対し、補完療法を取り入れた統合医療を提供し、肉体的、感情的、精神的、霊的な側面を含む全人的な治療を行っているんですが、その一環として2年前からイアン先生によるシロシビンを使った精神医療も行われるようになりました。自然療法医としてのイアン先生のキャリアは22年に及び、12年前から精神科医療にも携わっていらっしゃいます。今年になってからは、日本人で初めてシロシビンアシステッドセラピーのファシリテーターの資格を取られたビショップ直子さんと共同でのシロシビンセッションも行っていらっしゃいます。シロシビンを使った治療に対する先生の経験やお考えを伺っていきたいと思います。
Um, a big reason why I got into, offering psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, therapy, was because I was interested in end-of-life care and recognizing, that there's a window of opportunity at the end of life for people, family, and the person who's dying to actually heal, and recognize that the psilocybin has a pretty significant spiritual component to it. And that as a holistic healer, I'm interested in both, the physical pain, the emotional pain, the social pain, and spiritual pain. And I think at the end of life in particular, a lot of what hasn't been processed, whether it's trauma or unresolved feelings, and one's spiritual connection with the earth, or with themselves, with their own nature, or in Christian or Judaism, all the religions really, that connection, comes to the forefront at the end of life. And we ask these questions: what continues? If this body is a guest house and is only here, we're in this body temporarily, this form body, is there anything that continues afterwards? And so that's really driven a lot of my interest in psilocybin. I mean, on the surface, right, it's being used to treat depression and anxiety and trauma. But I think really when you look a little bit deeper underneath what's driving the depression, anxiety, and trauma, there's some pretty significant existential questions about mortality, and about fear around dying, and fear around what happens when we die, and what happens afterwards. And I think that psilocybin, in a really beautiful way, gets at some of those deeper questions. Who am I? What is the nature of mind? What is the nature of reality? And psilocybin offers us glimpses in that direction. So it dovetails quite a bit with some of my own spiritual beliefs in terms of Buddhism. And it's been really, working with the people from Japan coming, it's been such a joy to work with people coming from a culture that still has aspects of Shinto and Buddhism, both. And what's really been amazing for me is that the connection with the ancestors is still quite strong. And I think that that's one of the things that psilocybin, in my experience, we can heal, we connect with our ancestors during a psilocybin experience. People talk with their grandparents and their great-grandparents. People are able to, communicate and engage with people that have died. And that can be so healing, just to realize that we're not alone, that we're still connected, that this life is like a river connecting us with the ancestors in the past and the future, and that we're just a small water molecule in this vast river heading out to sea, right? And I think especially in terms of ancestral trauma, which comes up a lot during psilocybin sessions. Naoko and I just did a session with a woman of Jewish heritage whose grandfather was in a concentration camp. And she was really able to see clearly how some of that trauma that her grandparents experienced filtered into her parents and how they raised her. And some of the ideas and fears and anxieties and superstitions that weren't really serving her at all. She saw them clearly and how they originated from trauma. And that was such a relief and an unburdening of what she had been carrying around and what had been weighing her down in terms of anxiety and depression, to see that clearly. I've worked with some Native American people here whose grandparents were in the boarding schools and abused and mistreated and, had their hair cut and stripped of their language and culture and song and spiritual belief system and forced into this narrow, colonizing American culture. And for them to see clearly, what are they still carrying from that trauma that happened, 40, 50, 60, 80 years ago? To see that clearly is deeply healing. Right. When we see things clearly, to quote Tina Turner, when we see things clearly, we can change anything. And I think that's psilocybin provides for us a deep insight and a very clear vision into what is distuned within us that we're carrying that's not us, but it's ours, whether it's through epigenetics or environmental behavioral things that are passed down. So that's one thing, is that connection with the ancestors, which I think has come quite naturally to the Japanese clients that I've worked with. The other aspect, which dovetails quite beautifully with Zazen, is a non-conceptual perception of reality. Beyond good and bad, beyond right and wrong, but just things as they are, without our added narrative and layering of construct of emotional, mental fixation. To see things really as they are. And to have an opportunity to see things from a non-dual perspective. Not one, not two, but how do we hold these polarities in a way where they may both be true? And what's that thing in the middle of those two where we want to land, really, in a space that's inclusive of all of it, but not fixated on either, and not pushing away either extreme? But how can we be in that middle, kind of liminal, in-between space? And just stay there. It gives a lot of insight. I don't think that psychedelics are they don't replace meditation. But I do think that they give us some deep spiritual insights that help motivate people along the spiritual path. I know that's been true for me, that my own experiences have really motivated me to want to spend more time meditating, to want to spend more time, within my Sangha, my spiritual community. Yeah, I mean, we're using some psychotherapy along with this. So primarily internal family systems, which is a psychotherapeutic model that's being used within psychedelic medicine a lot right now. Especially the MAPS, MDMA research that they did. And internal family systems is really helpful for creating kind of a scaffolding to understand a psychedelic experience, because we're not a monomind. You know, this concept of Ian is actually a multiplicity of a lot of parts. There's not just one Dr. Ian. You know, we're all multiplicities of different levels of consciousness, different dimensions, different aspects, different personality structures. And, you know, our consciousness kind of weaves between different perspectives through the day. We might have a perspective in the morning that's very different from the afternoon, for example. And so to get a sense of all of the parts, that some of which cause us suffering, some of which may separate us from other people and ourselves. And especially when there's been trauma early in childhood, we develop compensations to keep ourselves safe. So how do we look at the compensations that are trying to keep ourselves safe, see how they may have helped us at one point in our life, but might be burdens and separating us from living a full life now? To see those clearly, and then to drop down underneath to what is the pain, what is the fear, what is the trauma that's underlying that, and then to bring as much compassion and love to that underlying primary wound as we can, to recognize that we're having a human experience, that we're not different than any other human being, that the first noble truth of suffering is true for everyone. And that really what we're working with is this illusion of separateness, right? Which really makes us suffer. What is me? What is not me? How do we dissolve that barrier? And psychedelics are really good at taking that ego structure, those boundaries down. And the psychotherapeutic aspect of internal family systems provides some languaging in order to do that. It's okay just to let go of all of these self-referential ideas of I am who I am and I am separate. What happens when we drop and let go of all that self-referentiality and step into a referenceless place? And the connection that happens between people, the unity consciousness that can happen with the earth and the trees and the sky and the moon and the sun and the stars, that we are not separate from any of that. We think we are, and that's part of the confusion. But these medicines are able to, you know, lessen that confusion, to see things as they are. And, you know, like I said, they don't substitute for practice. You still need to practice. But they can open the door to see things more clearly, and then keep on working slowly toward a deeper understanding of our non-separateness. So, you know, internal family systems is primarily the psychological model that I'm using to provide a framework to do this work. I also use ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. Ketamine is very different from psilocybin. The similarities that they share is that they're both neuroplastic agents, meaning they help us grow new neural pathways and develop new narratives of thinking about ourselves, reality, this earth, our relationships. How it's different is that I think that ketamine really allows us to drop this sort of self-referentiality that we have all the time. What Iris Murdoch described as unselfing. Well, we're not thinking, how does this relate to myself? How does this relate to me? But to drop all that and to step into a space that's very open and spacious and boundless. And from that perspective, we're able to look at these various parts within us that some of them create suffering for us. Wow, that's that part of depression that's linked with this experience in childhood. I can see that clearly now, without it being like this and consuming me. I have a little space around it. And ketamine is very helpful for that. Cannabis can be very helpful for that as well. There's a spaciousness aspect to cannabis as well, you know, when it's used in a way that's therapeutically oriented. And at end of life as well, both for pain, but also for that spaciousness I'm talking about. Psilocybin is different in that I see it, I like to use the Greek myth of Persephone and Demeter, and Persephone making a downward journey into the underworld and allowing herself to die, and then to be reborn along with springtime when Demeter, her mother, celebrates her return and everything grows again and the crops return, and you know, this very agrarian ritual that goes back to the ancient Greeks and the Eleusinian mysteries that Plato and Aristophanes and Aeschylus all participated in. But psilocybin helps us go down and allows the ego structures and the parts of us to die that we're not needing anymore. And it's not uncommon during a really deep psilocybin session, and this can happen too with ketamine, where people will look over and they'll say, Dr. Ian, am I dead? You know? And that is a very, it's a really fertile moment in many ways. No, you're not dead, but there's parts of you that aren't serving you anymore, that you're seeing clearly, that you're allowing yourself to let go of. And it's okay that they're dying. And you will be reborn, hopefully into a truer, an authentic self that's free of some of these burdens that have been weighing you down, sometimes for a lifetime. We're constantly dying and being reborn. You know, every out-breath, every in-breath, letting go and re-emerging into a new person. I mean, every 7 years, every cell in our body has totally been reconstituted. We physically are totally new people. And so that, you know, that's a little bit of the difference between ketamine and psilocybin as I see it. And recently, this is from Dr. Scott Shannon in Colorado. He's been doing something called the psilocybin sandwich, where you start with ketamine and you kind of initiate somebody into a non-ordinary state of consciousness. And they're able to explore what are those parts they're working with. And then you do an integration, then the next day you do a psilocybin experience, and you really take that deep dive down into Persephone's, you know, to the Hades, and then come back up. And then you do another ketamine experience on the tail end of everything to help integrate your psilocybin experience. And really powerful to do it in that way and to combine the two. So that's another therapeutic that I've been exploring. I talked with Dr. Shannon a few weeks ago about his protocol and why he uses it. And it's intuitive why that would be helpful. And so far it has been. Yeah, I mean, I think that psilocybin's useful in a, you know, whenever whenever I meet with somebody, I do, usually a half-hour meet and greet, complimentary, just to get a sense of what they're wanting to work on and who they are and whether this would be a good fit for them. And I'm trying to get more discerning in who would be a better fit for psilocybin, who would be a better fit for ketamine, who would be a good fit for a psilocybin sandwich. And, I don't think that this is medicine for everybody. I don't think this is a one-size-fits-all medicine. And people come with a lot of very lofty expectations about what these medicines are able to accomplish. So part of, I want people to have realistic expectations. I want people to really understand that psilocybin especially is the deep end of the pool. And are you really ready to let go? Because some people aren't truly ready to let go of what's familiar. Even if that's been deep depression. If it's familiar over 10, 15, 30 years, it's familiar and they don't want to let go of it because it's kept them safe. That depression has come for a reason, as anxiety has, as post-traumatic stress disorder has come for a reason. And unless people are truly ready to let that go, it can be a difficult psilocybin experience. But if people are motivated to truly heal and truly look deeply at the true nature of who they are and what's been burdening them all these years, and to let that go, and they can go into this as an intrepid explorer of their own consciousness, psilocybin's a good fit. If there's a lot of trauma that has been unresolved and I haven't looked at, then I think ketamine's a better fit for them typically because it's a more gentle approach to that trauma. Similarly, MDMA is a very gentle approach to that trauma because there's so much self-love and radical self-acceptance and compassion on board, which is a really beautiful perspective to work with your trauma. But I like to caution people that if there's a lot of unresolved trauma, going into a psilocybin session could stir that up really strongly. And unless there's good integration work on the tail end, that trauma can be right there at the surface and create more problems in your life. And Naoko and I have seen that with this recent client that I was describing who had been on 3 psilocybin sessions with somebody who I think didn't really understand the importance of integration. And it stirred up her trauma, but then she was left worse off than when she started because there was no resolution. And she did this 3 times. And it just built up into the point where she was almost needing to develop new compensations just to deal with the trauma of having the trauma re-triggered, but with no resolution to it. And so this is where the therapeutic of integration is so important. It's probably at least 60%, 70% of the whole experience. We have this experience, we have all this insight, these epiphanies, but what do we do with them then? How do we convert altered states into altered traits is kind of the slogan.
So you two work together on the same client, so you will both be present in the session.
Yeah. It's absolutely wonderful to work with Naoko. She's so present and brings so much attunement to the patients. And it's also, this was the MAPS MDMA model, is that they'd have one female therapist and one male therapist. And I think sometimes it kind of represents the archetypal cosmic mother and father, although sometimes people project that I'm the mother. which can happen. People have said that before. But working, the two of us together, there's a real magic to that. And I think people really feel held. The container is tight, and a lot of compassion, a lot of safety, a lot of presence. And that kind of crucible is what's necessary for this deep alchemical healing of this transmutation of delusion into awareness, right? It's a conversion of confused mind into seeing things clearly. Yeah. Most of them are from Oregon, but we have a number of people coming in from out of state too. I have a man from France coming next month. I've had people, this woman that we recently spoke to was from the Southwest. She flew in. I did a group with end-of-life professionals, hospice physicians, palliative care nurses, death doulas. That's what they're called. Canada, New York, New Jersey, California, Texas. So people are flying into Oregon from all over for this treatment. And I'm really proud of Oregon, actually, how progressive it's been, and with cannabis as well. But it really sees the need and how helpful these medicines can be. And another thing that some legislation that Oregon passed is that we were the first state to pass the death with dignity. So physician aid in dying. And I just think that's so interesting. In 89, we passed that. And I think it's so interesting that we were the first state to pass that legislation, and that we're the first state to pass psilocybin legislation, because both are involved with death in different ways, and an acceptance of death, and the death rebirth experience with psilocybin.